Hey everybody, welcome to today's video. So today I'm kind of kicking off a new video series about my Mustang behind me here. And in the past I've done a lot of work to this car. I haven't really filmed any of it because it's just something I do for fun on my own time and kind of therapeutic for me. But this year I'm going to get into some more performance kinds of modifications that may be more interesting. I bought this car a couple years ago from a friend. Actually, I was with him when he bought it, Dan, back in 2004, I believe it was. And I've always liked this car. And a few years ago, he decided that he was going to sell it. Actually, I kind of asked him if he was going to drive it, and he thought maybe he hadn't driven it in a few years and would sell it instead. So we made a deal, and I bought it from him. And since then, I've done a lot of work to it just to make it a car that I can drive and have fun. In fact, when I drove it home, I found that it lost all the coolant on the drive home. It's about a 2-hour drive, and that was from a bad head gasket. So I actually had another 5-liter high output engine from another Mustang on an engine stand at that time. So the first thing I did is swap out the engine. And during that, I replaced all the gaskets and cleaned everything and made it look good, put a new water pump on it, coolant hoses, belts, spark plugs, spark plug wires, a new radiator, engine mounts, the list goes on, just to make the engine run and perform how it should. Um, it had some bad tires on it, so I put tires on it that year. It didn't have tailpipes when I got it. Actually, I was part of the adventure when the tailpipes got bent previously and removed. So I put some tailpipes on it because I was actually commuting in it all summer. The year that I bought it, like 2-3 months, I was commuting in it. Needed tailpipes for the drive. I drive like 40 minutes into work. Also, the seat belts wouldn't retract. They'd just come out and they'd stay out, and you had to constantly try and adjust them, get them to retract. So I put a set of seat belts on it. Um, that was kind of the first year. Get it running, make it safe. Then last year, about this time, I had the whole suspension out of the car. Pulled the rear axle out of the car and put all new bushings in the control arms, put polyurethane and everything. Dropped out the fuel tank and put a new fuel pump in it at that time, an ascending unit because the fuel gauge didn't work and the fuel pump was noisy. Then I took the whole front suspension apart and put polyurethane in all of that and replaced a few shocks that were worn out and tie rod ends and now the car's at a point where it's a really good driver. It's really reliable. It's fun to drive. And I know it's always going to start and work well for me. And I've put a few other things in it just to make it reliable. But in short, that's the list. I'm the kind of guy that likes doing burnouts and driving fast and having fun in a car. And this engine, it's the 5-liter high output. It makes when it was new, maybe 220 horsepower. But it needs some more. It's enough to have fun and be a good car to drive, but it's kind of lacking in the power department. So I've got a couple of goals here. One of them is I like to drive, and I don't want to make this into a race car that I can't enjoy in the street. So it has to be, a really drivable, fun car. And that really plays into the kind of modifications that I do. Another thing is I don't want to break the budget. So, I want to get the best bang for my buck. I could go out and I could spend, $3,000 on a heads and intake kit and then everything that goes along with that. And all of a sudden you got $5,000-$6,000 into the engine. Easily, really easy to do. And I don't want to spend that much money on it if I can help it. I can also use some wheels and tires, and those get really expensive really fast, but the tires that are on it, they drive fine. The wheels don't look all that great, but the tires work fine. So, I'm going to postpone that for a little bit. But what I decided to do this year is I have some cylinder heads on my table here. These are actually off of an Explorer, a 5-liter Explorer. They're called GT40P cylinder heads. And the Explorer is actually made closer to 300 horsepower. I think it was 290. A big part of that's because they have heads that flow better, they have a bigger intake manifold, and a few other changes. So these are heads off of an Explorer, and what I'm going to do is pull all the valves out of them and do a little bit of polishing in the ports, maybe even open the ports up a little bit. But see if I can take these heads that are better than what I have and make them even a little bit better, because I picked these up for a couple $100. For a few more $100 into them, I could probably have, a $600 heads and cam combination that can get this car up in the 300, 350 horsepower range. So that's much better than $2,500 or $3,000 to go out and buy some performance heads and intake off the internet. Maybe not as good, and these are iron. A lot of the heads you'd buy aftermarket are aluminum, so these are heavier. But it really saves money. And for what I do, I'm probably not going to notice the difference in 40, 50 pounds cylinder head weight. So anyhow, that's the kind of the fast but long version of the story. I'm going to make a few videos here as I kind of dig into this car, and probably soon here I'll have the engine out of it again and the transmission, and go to work on making this car a little bit better performing. So anyhow, let's start with the cylinder heads. Okay, so I started porting the heads here, and I'll show you fundamentally what I'm doing with the head porting job. And when you hear about people replacing heads, cam, intake on their car, and they get big horsepower, how does that happen? It doesn't just happen because they have different heads. The different heads flow better. It's easier for air to pass through the heads. So what I'm doing with these Explorer heads is basically just polishing them to make it easier for air to flow. So here, what I'm doing. So this is the head, and I have removed the valves, valve springs, the rocker arms. So now you can see there's just holes where the valves normally would go. So this is where a spark plug would come through from the other side. Then this larger hole is the intake, and the smaller hole is the exhaust. And especially on a naturally aspirated engine like this, an engine that isn't supercharged or turbocharged, you're almost always going to have a larger intake valve than exhaust valve. And the reason is because the engine has to essentially suck air through the intake system, but it's pushing it out of the exhaust. It's pressurized coming out of the exhaust. So you can move more air easily through the exhaust because it's under pressure. Whereas on the intake, any kind of a restriction makes a big difference. So for the limited space that you have above the piston, you want to use more of that for the intake valve. So on this side here, this is the intake side of the cylinder head. So you have a gasket on here, then the intake manifold sits on top of it. And here's what an intake port looks like. And these are cast cylinder heads. The manufacturing process basically uses a sand mold that they pour molten iron into, then the iron cools and it hardens, but that's called casting. And you can see that it's really rough and bumpy in here because that's where essentially sand was when this head was made. So you end up with, the same kind of rough surface that you'd have if you were just to flatten sand. It's not going to be perfectly flat. Then you get some different, markings on it. There's probably some kind of a holding fixture that sat here, so you got an extra burr. And in here you can see that it's, pretty straight shot through, but there's a couple spots that, you can tell that there's a seam where two parts of the casting mold came together. So essentially what I want to do, this is a port that I started porting. So you can see here that the first thing I did is try to flatten out that spot that there is a fixture on. You can see more easily here where there's a seam on the wall from 2 parts of the casting mold. So I'm going to try and, grind that down and sand it down. And I'm, just starting on this port. I'm probably not even halfway done yet doing this. But you can see that this is a, pretty smooth, shiny surface in general. Still needs some work compared to this surface here that's really rough from the casting. So, that small roughness creates turbulence in the air. Let me turn my light on here. Maybe that'll help. There we go. So that roughness causes turbulence in the air, and turbulence takes up more space, and therefore less air can flow through. Whereas here, where it's smooth, the air can flow through more easily, there's less turbulence, and therefore you can get more volume. More air volume means more cylinder pressure means more horsepower. So, this is a really time-consuming way to get more power out of heads, but it's a good way to get more power cheap. So, right now it's middle of January, driving this car for probably, a few more months yet, so time is on my side. As long as I stick at this, I'll have plenty of time to port the heads, take them to a machine shop, get the valves ground, get new springs put in it. And these heads will perform fairly well, I think, since I have the time to do all of that. So now that I have the first step of porting underway here, which basically is going inside of the port bore and taking out the rough edges, taking out the casting roughness, I'm starting to work on the second step here. And also I just got a gasket set in the mail today. So I'm going to do some port matching, which basically means that I am taking my intake manifold gasket here, and I'm putting that against the cylinder head and marking off my port size on here. So you can see on this port, I've got it roughly in place here. You can see where the gasket sits over the port and that there's some cylinder head area that comes within the port, the gasket, the port hole in the gasket. So what I've done is gone across all of these ports with a Sharpie marker and marked out roughly, the additional material on here that I can take off to open these ports up some more. And whenever you have a change in size in the port, like the intake gasket, where it goes from the intake manifold into the gasket, then into the cylinder head, that change in the port size creates a rough edge here, and rough edges create turbulence, and turbulence creates inefficiency. So what I want to do is have that transition at the gasket be the same size from the intake manifold through the gasket into the cylinder head, so there's no rough edge. So like I said, I'm going to take my grinder and cut away that additional material to match the port on the head to the gasket, or gasket matching. So let's go ahead and do that. Finished porting out that one port to gasket match it. So let's take a look at that port now compared to the other ports on the head. All right, so there's that port that I've gasket matched, and gonna overlay the gasket here so you can see. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good, and it's a lot better than it was before. You can see on this one that there's quite a bit more cylinder head material showing through around the gasket compared to this one that I just did. So this bore is a lot smoother, a lot larger, or at least a little bit larger since I matched the gasket, compared to this one that has a lot of extra material around the gasket, and of course the bore isn't nearly as smooth. I haven't touched this bore at all. So, just a little bit of work here, and I have, between these steel burrs and the abrasive sanding discs, probably total I've got like $40 or $50 into those. So you can see that I can really open up these heads and smooth them out for pretty cheap. So once I take these to the machine shop and get the heads resurfaced and the valve seats ground, and in addition to opening up these ports, I think these are going to flow quite a bit better and make some halfway decent horsepower for actually pretty cheap. So anyhow, I'm going to get to the rest of the ports and get these all cleaned up. So I am pretty much done with the porting now, and it's actually turned out pretty good. I'm happy with the results. It took quite a bit longer than I thought that it would. It's probably somewhere between like 2 to 3 hours per head by the time that I pull the valves out, then do the porting and then polish the ports and get all the valves back in. But the results actually is pretty good. It's the first time I've done this, so it's not like a pro expert job. But these, the ports look pretty smooth. They're definitely opened up. The area, let's see, in here, there was some pretty sharp edges on the intake ports. So I, smoothed those edges out and opened it up a little bit. And same thing on the exhaust. There was really an edge here that I rounded off, and that's going to make the airflow a lot better. And then overall, I just kind of went through and polished all these ports up so that they just flow better. Originally, the inside the ports is basically the same texture as the outside of the cylinder head. It's just a cast surface. So now that anywhere where it's shiny is basically where I've taken that, that casting, the grains from the casting off, and it's just a smooth area now, which is going to create less turbulence in the ports, and less turbulence means better airflow. So for a stock Explorer head that makes good power over a stock Mustang head anyhow, to just smooth those ports out and take out the sharp edges, that's going to be a pretty good power gain. And then of course I also, on the intake ports, I put the gaskets on here and match the ports to the gasket opening, and I'll do the same thing on the intake manifold so that there's no transition area where a nice wide intake port, and then a smaller gasket, and then a wider port in the head. Again, that rough edge causes turbulence and that restricts airflow, so that's going to really help. I talked to a machine shop already a couple of days ago about the condition of these heads, and they've been sitting in my shed for a couple of years. So you can see that the deck surface where it's going to mate against the engine block is actually kind of rusty. And if I rub it, if I get a little bit of steel wool, it more or less comes right off. But I asked them, are they going to be able to clean up these port areas and clean up the deck? I know that they can mill it to flatten it out again. How much can they take off and still be safe? And without even seeing the heads, they said, it's no problem. We're going to be able to clean it up, mill them. The heads should be fine. So as long as there's no cracks on the heads, no test for cracks too, as long as there's no cracks, I should be able to use these. So now I'm going to put the valves back in this head. The second head is already reassembled. It's done, ready to go to the machine shop. So I get the valves back in here, and then probably tomorrow, today's Sunday, so tomorrow when the machine shop's open, I'll drop these off, and maybe in a week or two, they'll get them ready and I'll get them back. So anyhow, let's get these valves back in and get them ready to go to the machine shop.